or you eat this keto thing. So now you're living on, meat and fish and fowl and green leafy vegetables and butter and cheese and, and there are a lot of people who like it and think it's great. And some people, me, we're biased. And if you do this, your diabetes is likely to go into remission and you won't have symptoms and you won't have the drug therapy and you won't apparently have to worry about the increased risk of heart disease and stroke and cancer and dementia and the neuropathies and the amputations and the retinopathies and the blindness. It's your choice.
You're listening to the Family Health Lab. Healthy parents, healthy kids.
Hi Gary, welcome. Lovely to have you on.
Hi Claire, thank you for having me.
You have a very serious scientific background. You studied at Stanford and Harvard, and I was wondering whether writing was always going to feature for you.
The answer is no. I did study physics at Harvard, but I was a lousy student and not that motivated. So eventually I read a book called All the President's Men about the journalistic research that went into the impeachment of President Richard Nixon here in the United States, and I decided I wanted to be an investigative reporter. And when I went to journalism school, and when I got out of journalism school, I realized that I could not get a job in reporting except in New York City, where I wanted to be, and in science reporting. So I became eventually an investigative science reporter. Turns out the world needs those. And I wrote 2 books on bad science, episodes of bad science, and that led me. Actually, friends of mine in the physics community said if you're interested in bad science, you should look at the stuff in public health that's terrible. And so in the early 90s, I moved into public health, and they were right. It was terrible science, and that brought me into nutrition, where either we're all deluded or the science there is even worse than it is in public health. That's what I've been doing since the late 90s, beginning with a series of investigations for the journal Science that won me some major journalism awards, and then some infamous cover stories in the New York Times Magazine, and 5 books.
Yeah. And so much influence on the public discourse around food, what we eat, what we should eat, and the science that got us there, the science behind the guidelines. You have been one of the most influential figures really in this whole discourse and influencing big changes in nutritional policy, really. Out of all of my guests that I've had on, your name has cropped up the most as an influence on the people that I've had on. So Dr. Robert Lufkin, Dr. Philippa Vardia, Dr. Rod Taylor. I mean, pretty much most of them, if not all, have cited you and your work as being crucial influences. And of course, Nina and Daischels. So was that a hope? These are big books. These are what crops up when anybody is talking or reviewing your work is how extraordinarily and extensively well researched your work is and referenced. So was it a hope when you go in, you must take on this task, mammoth tasks of these books? Is it your hope that you do change and influence how we eat and the public conversation?
Well, when you start the books, you don't realize how mammoth the task is. It's, the phrase often used is going down the rabbit hole, but you start doing your research and then you realize that there are some dogmatic assumptions people have made over the years, and we'll talk about those, that don't seem to be supported by the evidence, or at least the evidence they cite. So then you have to start reading the papers that they cite, and then you have to read the papers that those papers cite, and then you have to just keep sort of going back in time to try and find it's like the old kind of mythological idea that the earth is standing on the sitting on the back of an elephant, the elephant standing on an elephant. You have to keep going down, trying to find solid ground. And so in my research, it meant just going further and further back in time, looking for the original evidence on which these belief systems were founded. I also hate writing, which is not a great situation for somebody who makes a living writing. Yeah, so research is a great tool of procrastination. As long as you can continue to do research, you don't have to start writing. And since I also have I think critically, and I have an insatiable curiosity about these things, there's always questions that need to be answered. And always either people to talk to or to interview or papers to read that hold out the promise of answering them. The problem is with each paper you read, the papers have 50 or 60 or 100 or 200 references. And you have to, the paper will make a statement and you have to determine if that statement is based on the facts, because in this world it often isn't. That was one of the first learning experiences when I was doing these investigations for science, is people would make declarative statements either in an interview or in a paper, and their references wouldn't support the statement that was being made. So it's, you start at the top of the pyramid, changing my metaphor here, and the pyramid just gets wider and wider. And the next thing you know, you've spent 5 years on a book and barely, scratched the surface of what could have been done. And in some way, all my books have been sort of unpacking specific sections. In my first book, where I had to write a chapter and could have written an entire book about it, and then later I did write an entire book about it.
I mean, that's how I see your work, that, taking on a specific subject and then really going very, very, very deep into the basis of where that has come from, and uncovering to the public that the wisdoms, the truths that we know about food for absolute certainty are based on very shaky ground, as you've just used the term, and bad science. So really, really powerful and disturbing stuff. But that takes us to your book, your latest book, Rethinking Diabetes. And again, it's this, really looking at two tenets with that book, looking at the history of diabetes, of the science and the medical advice and the treatments and the protocols and what routes we've taken, and the different paths of that. And then looking at the science and how we arrive at the science and how we form science and medical guidelines. So just thinking about that particular book, diabetes, it's the go-to now really to cover everything you need to know about diabetes. Looking at the reviews and who's reading that, mainly people living with diabetes type 2 predominantly. What were you hoping that would be your major readership for that book, that people who have got the condition themselves or somebody in their family, and what were you hoping that they might take away for their own lives?
Okay, so at this point, it gets a little complicated. My interests have always been good science and bad science. Like, how do you establish reliable knowledge about whatever subject you're studying? And on some level, all my books have been about that. It's a theme in all of them. When I went from writing about physics and nuclear physics and bad science and those fields to nutrition, the real advantage was my readership increased dramatically. So now I could actually get paid enough to spend 5 years on a book. And the books had obvious implications for patients and physicians and doctors. And as you pointed out, a lot of the people in the field got into this field in part because they read my work, or they read people who in turn had read my work. So, there's the researchers in the field who got on this early, like Eric Westman and Jeff Volek and Steve Finney, and who were studying low-carb diets. And then I was the first journalist to really start writing about it from a perspective that people could trust. And then because my books have had such influence that way, there are now hundreds, perhaps, books out there that give guidance to patients and are written by physicians or the individuals who suffer from the diseases they're writing about, and do a very good job of giving advice. I would quibble with some of the science and everything because I'm that kind of annoying guy. But at this point, I'm not really trying to write for patients anymore, because what they need is advice, and what they want is advice. And often people say, we don't need all this history. Just tell us what to do. Like, we'll trust you. Our doctor said we could trust you, so tell us what to do. And so for those people, like I said, even for diabetes, there's probably a half a dozen good books for patients with diabetes. Advocate talking about low-carb diets and how to do it. And with type 1 diabetes, Dr. Bernstein's Diabetes Solution is still, the best thing to read. So I write on one level the books I think have to be written, the stories that I think have to be told to influence the people who don't already think like we do. So I'm writing for the people, and they're the heads of like the Australian Diabetes Associations and the hospital administrators and the endocrinologists who are least willing to read my books, but they're the ones I want to convince.
Okay.
And because I rely so much on the history, because I'm talking about how the science evolved, and to do that, if you're going to make the claim that the therapeutic approach in 2024 is completely wrong, you're going to have to explain how we got here. It's not enough for me just to say it's wrong. I want to understand how we got here, how the mistakes were made, so other people, including myself, can understand how very well-meaning individuals and very smart doctors and researchers could come to such obviously wrong conclusions. And then I want to write that so if they have an open enough mind, they'll read it. So I'm writing on some level to the smallest possible audience, only the people who have to be basically held at gunpoint to read my books. And then I'm hoping if you do that, they'll read it. In the process, I try to make them readable. I would write a book that I want to read, and that had it not been written by me, I would still want to read it. But Rethinking Diabetes it's a medical history as much as anything else, and it's a history of bad science, not good science. And then I'm trying to show what the good science should have been. And I'm a journalist, so you can't just say, trust me on this. Like, if I'm a doctor, I could say, look, when I gave this patient this diet, this happened. So I think I could give you this diet and this will happen. And they'll trust you because you're a doctor. But I'm a journalist, so I have different people hold me to different standards. So it's a terrific book. It's a difficult read. And I think patients and family members would benefit from reading it, but they certainly don't need it. What they need is good advice. My book will give them the reason why they have to go to people like you for good advice rather than their local physician and diabetes educator. So it might give them faith that the advice they're getting is right.
Yes, and build the case for people like me and for the organisations that I work with, to have that tool to not just convince people, but to demonstrate that what we're saying isn't just that we're in a particular camp, we like this style of eating. It's much more than that. It's we're not simply diet fad or zealots or anything like that. It's this powerful medical therapy that we're talking about.
In diabetes, the other issue is that the conventional therapies have obvious failings. At least in the U.S., when you look at the data, that population with both type 2 and type 1 diabetes are not thriving despite this continual revolution in drug and device therapy.
Yeah.
They're struggling. Their lifespan is their life expectancy is considerably shorter than people without diabetes. The episodes of hypoglycemia are still sort of unacceptably high. Their average hemoglobin A1C levels, their blood sugar is still unacceptably high. They're still at increased risk of major diseases. There's still, most of the lower limb amputations in the United States, at least, are from poorly controlled diabetes, and that just shouldn't be happening. And so it's not just that we have what looks to be a very powerful therapy and a very obvious one. The conventional therapies are not doing well. They should be doing much better. It's hard to understand why they're doing so poorly, but again, I suggest reasons in the book that the history supports. It's never a good idea to give anyone insulin except type 1 diabetics people with type 1 diabetes who can't live without it. So those are sort of the two issues with diabetes that make it so important from a kind of scientific theory perspective, which is that this is a disorder in which the carbohydrate content of the diet undeniably plays a major role, and yet we treat it with carbohydrate-rich diets for the most part, and drug therapy to deal with that on top of the carb-rich diets, and that's just...
Oh, sorry. My son's just saying goodbye to me. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
He doesn't normally do that when I'm in here, but he decided to now.
It's all right. Be grateful that he is, because my son just went off to college 2,500 miles away, and I would be desperate for him to be interrupting me now to tell me he's going out. So.
Yes, well, mine doesn't normally, but it was lovely. He did a love heart, which is so nice as well. So 400 million people around the world have diabetes. I mean, we just band these kind of figures around, don't we? As though this is normal, expected. I mean, that in itself is crazy. So 400 million, and 1 in 9 Americans have diabetes, and through your book, through your research, we can see how rare this condition was. I wondered if you could take us back to the point where it went from a completely rare unknown to becoming a more recognised condition. I think that part of the history is interesting. I mean, it also shows where we start to fork with those other aspects that you've brought in, the therapy route that we decided to go down. But yeah, would you take us back to that point of where we were when it was rare, and how the medical professions were investigating it?
Type 2 diabetes, after the sort of pancreas gets exhausted, becomes quite similar to type 1 diabetes, and also has a very steady progression, although it's possible that people with the disease would not have ended up in the hospitals in the 19th century. And the hospitals in the 19th century also tended to be for the lower socioeconomic classes. The wealthier, higher status individuals got sick at home and got treated at home. But that said, there are hospitals that make their medical records available to the public, and that in the U.S., particularly Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston and then Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia, which are 2 of the oldest hospitals in the United States. And through the mid-19th century, they often had years without a single case of diabetes. So as you pointed out, 1 in 9 Americans have diabetes today, and in some hospital populations, 1 in 4 patients, like the Veterans Administration's hospitals in the U.S., 1 in 4 patients is diagnosed with diabetes. These major hospitals saw 0 patients through the second half of the 19th century, when you could see the numbers start ticking up, 2 a year, 4 a year, 7 a year. by the early 1920s, the newspapers and medical journals were discussing a diabetes epidemic then. And the assumption was that it was either caused by people getting heavier because they were sedentary and eating too much, all calories in effect, or sugar specifically, because this increase in diabetes that you could see in the hospital records coincides almost exactly with the increase in basically the creation of a sugar industry. Sugar goes from being a very expensive luxury item in the beginning of the 19th century to a very cheap item that's available in all foods and beverages by the end of the 19th century. So from like 4 pounds per person per year in the U.S. in the beginning of the 19th century to 90 pounds by the end. And in the middle, in the 1840s, you get the formation, the candy industry starts, the ice cream industry starts, the chocolate industry starts, and then in the 1870s, 1880s, you get the soft drink industry with Coca-Cola and PepsiCo and Dr. Pepper. And so by the 1920s, diabetes prevalence and the diabetes mortality, the number of the people who are have diabetes on their death certificate have increased in some American cities by 20-fold already. And that increase continues through the 20th century into the crazy numbers we see today. And then you see these obesity and diabetes epidemics erupting in every other population that transitions from whatever their native diet is to a Western diet and lifestyle. And then we can argue about what the causes are, and people do. I mean, it's clear that the Western diet triggers obesity and diabetes. Folks like me, in our world, we say it's because of the sugar and refined grain content. And then there are people who say it's the seed oils, toxic seed oils, a theory I'm not wowed by. And then the rest of the world says, well, people start eating Western foods, they eat too much, they can't stop, they get sedentary, and it's just the calories in effect. So that's the interesting thing with diabetes is that until 1921, when insulin was discovered, the standard of care was called the animal diet. So this was first popularized in 1797 by a British physician named Rollo, because he used this diet to apparently cure one of his patients of diabetes, and nobody had ever says he only saw 3 in his entire medical career, and the second one he appeared to cure with this diet. So he wrote a pamphlet about it and circulated the pamphlet and asked other doctors to try it. And by the mid-19th century, it was the standard of care in the U.S., the U.K., Germany, Austria, France, wherever you found physicians treating diabetes, they would do it they'd say, look, they're diagnosing this by the presence of sugar in the urine. They could measure urine sugar. They could taste it, which their assistants had to do back then.
Which is something I didn't know. And that's why it's called that as well, because it's something to do with the sweetness in that. It's a disgusting fact I found in your book.
Everything's relative. So anyway, this guy Rollo thought, hey, if there's sugar in the urine, then he can't metabolize carbohydrates, so let's feed him a diet without carbs. Didn't use that term, but that was the idea. So it was basically fatty meat and green leafy vegetables. And like I said, through the 19th century into the 20th century, by the 20th century, they started adding more and more fat, because often a patient with diabetes wouldn't appear at the physician's office or the hospital until they were emaciated. They'd lost a lot of weight. So I assume you want to add the weight, get the weight back on them. So you want as many calories as humanly possible, but you can't feed them carbs, so you feed them fat. And so they would drink heavy cream and eat butter, and actually alcohol was a source of calories that they could feed both adults and children with diabetes. This diet, when followed, put type 2 diabetes into remission.
And was that a type of Ketovore diet.
Essentially, it was a ketogenic diet. They didn't, I mean, they knew about ketones, but they don't have any way to measure it. They could smell the acetone on the breath, but essentially it was a ketogenic diet. It would have had to be. And again, this was the standard of care. So it was high fat, meat, green vegetables, leafy vegetables. It shifted in the mid-1910s because of yet another Harvard doctor doing bad science. And then it vanishes entirely in 1921 when insulin is discovered. So as soon as insulin is discovered, produced from animal pancreases, you give it to patients, you lower their blood sugar, you get rid of sugar in the urine. The problem is you never know how much to give them. And the insulin that you're giving them, you never know how long it's going to act for, and it's going to be different in every patient and different in the same patient on different days and different times. And so you have this cure for the treatment for the diabetes that'll control the high blood sugar and the hunger and the thirst and all the symptoms of uncontrolled diabetes at the risk of killing the patient from low blood sugar and hypoglycemic episodes. So now what you want to do is give them insulin and feed them carbohydrates. You go from a standard of care where you don't feed these patients carbohydrates to one where you start giving them carbs to protect them from the side effects of the drug therapy. And as time goes on, doctors decide that, patients don't really want to be on diets. And we don't really believe our patients are sticking to our diets. Even when they say they're sticking to the diet, I mean, they didn't follow the diet for the last 7 weeks, and they knew they were coming in to see me, and I was going to take a urine test and measure their urine for sugar. So they went on the diet 3 days before coming in to see me. And so the easier thing to do is just to let them eat whatever they want and give them as much insulin as necessary to cover the carbs in the diet. And this becomes, again, sort of slowly the standard of care. At first, people first start writing about this tentatively, like by 1924. And then as time goes on, more and more physicians do it. And the patients say they feel better. They prefer it to this constant hypoglycemia threat that they're getting with the low-carb insulin diets. And again, at this point in time, they know that there's a kind of a difference between what we would call type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So the diabetes that afflicts children and is acute and kills quickly, and the diabetes that tends to afflict older adults and associates with weight and kills slowly, chronic, but they don't really treat the patients any differently. And often by the time the patients with type 2 diabetes show up in the hospital, like I said, it's because they've lost a lot of weight, their pancreas has stopped producing insulin, they're now hungry all the time and thirsty all the time and have all these other symptoms, peeing all the time, of uncontrolled type 1 diabetes. So they treat them all the same. And the idea is, let's just give them all insulin and let them eat what they want. And this becomes this common practice. And then by the 1930s, they realize that they're seeing this new kind of epidemic with diabetes patients. So if you imagine type 1 diabetes in a kid who's diagnosed maybe 12 or 14 years old, or 2 as your child was, and then without insulin, even with the very low-carb ketogenic diet, they need insulin. They're only going to live, a few years at most. So now you give them insulin, and it's a miracle cure. It's a wonder drug. You've kept these kids alive.
Yes, it does seem as though at that point in time, this was a miracle cure.
And people talked about it like it was a miracle. I mean, they had these kids who were starving them to keep their blood sugar down, and they were emaciated and weeks away from death. And you looked at pictures of them, they looked like they doctors would say this themselves 20 years later. They look like the pictures of people, in Auschwitz. And then you give them insulin and they start fattening up immediately. I mean, they get fat and healthy and rosy. And 2 weeks later, they're running around the ward. And 2 months later, they're back at work. I mean, it really seems like a miracle.
So there must have been such a buzz around this in the medical circles, sharing this information as they had done the animal diet and the low carbohydrate, although it wasn't called that diet. There must have just been such an excitement about this.
Nobody had ever seen anything like it. You read these initial reports and again, people talked about it in biblical terms. They talked about these patients being resurrected, like rising from the dead. And they did. They were. So now the problem is they're on the drug for 12, 15 years. They're eating these liberal carb diets that are getting ever more liberal as time goes on. And suddenly they start showing up in the hospital with all the sort of classic consequences of uncontrolled diabetes. So they're, arteriosclerotic plaques throughout their body. So they're getting heart attacks, they're getting strokes, they're getting nerve damage and neuropathies and amputations, are going blind. And in some cases, you read these case reports and it's heartbreaking. These kids who seem perfectly healthy are now dying in the core. They just, non-technical term, they crap out entirely, and within 2 years they're dead, or 1 year they're dead.
So we had the miracle, and we jumped on it as a medical society, and that became the only default treatment, and threw it at them. But we didn't have any idea what was around the corner, these long-term consequences.
No. And you didn't really need clinical trials. You didn't need clinical trials to see that it would benefit kids in the short run. And remember, because they're diagnosed when they're 2, 5, 10, 15, and then it keeps them alive for 12 or 15 years. They're still dying in their 20s, early 30s, horribly premature deaths, tragic. And when that starts happening and they get this tidal wave of diabetic complications that research journals start talking about in the 1930s, they have no real understanding what the cause is. They think of it as uncontrolled diabetes because they assume that the patients who do the worst job with controlling their blood sugar are the patients who are having the worst complications, but they don't know that. All they know is that they were letting these people eat liberal carb diets and giving them high doses of insulin, and both of them, together or separately, could be responsible for the complications. It's conceivable that that this was just a long-term effect of the insulin therapy, which sounds irrational, but if you think of type 2 diabetes as insulin resistance, and that means high doses, hyperinsulinemia, high doses of circulating insulin in the blood at all time of day, and these people are at increased risk of heart disease and stroke and cancer and neuropathies and kidney disease and all the rest. It's quite possible that the insulin therapy was causing the same problem, and I discuss the details of that later on. But insulin injected through a needle or through a pump into the abdomen or the butt or wherever, and then allowed to percolate into the circulation that way is a very different story than insulin being secreted from the pancreas in response to rising blood sugar. So one of the issues is by the late 1930s, you've got the medical community is starkly aware of all the complications of living with diabetes, both type 1 and type 2, although they still don't really differentiate. They don't know what the cause is. And they assume that it's the high blood sugar still, because that's how they're sort of determining the diabetic state. And the way you treat high blood sugar is insulin.
More insulin, more, yeah.
And so they just keep doing what they do. And then we could talk about what happens in the 60s and 70s, but that's sort of the basis. You have this disorder that's fundamentally marked by an intolerance for the carbohydrates in the diet. You cannot metabolize them safely. And then you let people eat as many carbohydrates as they want and treat that with enough insulin to cover the carbohydrates. That became people would consume their carbohydrates in specific regimens to make it easier for them to balance the insulin they were taking with carbs. But nobody was telling them, wait, let's go back to this pre-1921 approach and not eat the carbs, because we know you can't metabolize them safely. So it's a simplistic metaphor, but I've had a corn allergy my whole life. And when I was about 5 years old, I learned that if I don't want to live life with gastrointestinal distress, I can't eat corn. Mm-hmm. And so for the most part, I don't. I don't try to take the corn and take allergy medications, which I suppose would be a different way to do it. I just don't eat the corn. It's different than telling children not to have ice cream or cake or,
Yes, we're in a world where people are quite concerned by as not wanting to give children the cake, the pizza, the candy, the sweets. They're very concerned that that's going to be unfair to that child, that they're going to miss out, but really missing an amazing fact that, the majority of, take the American population, 90-something% now metabolically unwell, based pretty much on food. We can they call it lifestyle factors, chronic disease, lifestyle factors, but we're talking about the food. And in this case, it's with the diabetes. Fast forward to today, and we have people who are pushing low carbohydrate diets as an option for people, but the majority of the diabetes educated diabetes bodies have, for up until this point in time, continued to let people and train people to support people to have as many carbohydrates as they want and take the medications. You tell us. Oh, go on. Sorry, Gary.
No, I was just going to say, so the couple issues there. And one of the fascinating things about doing this research is, first of all, you can really understand what these doctors and parents were confronted with. So like type 1 diabetes is an awful affliction for a child. Do you really want to take their childhood away from them if you can give them a drug? And by taking their childhood away, and I have these discussions, I've had them with my wife in the 20, in the last 15 years about our kids. It's like, let them be kids. Let them eat ice cream and cake. And you don't want them sitting at the dinner table while their siblings are eating pasta and potatoes. And it always comes back to the sweets, cakes, and drinking Coca-Cola and ice cream, and these kids can't. So let them have the ice cream. And we got the drug, dose them for it. So that's one issue. The other issue is...
And Gary, what's your view on that discussion you were having with your wife? Who won?
That gets complex. If my kids, I have two sons, we've talked about, they're 15 and 18. Neither one of them had diabetes. Neither one of them was in danger as children of having to live with obesity. So I don't have to make decisions that other parents might have to make. But one thing when we discuss this, and especially the issue of, for instance, ketogenic diets tend to be animal product rich. In the United States, there's a big movement to get people off animal products because they think mostly plant diets are healthier, which the evidence supporting that is terrible. And they assume mostly plant diets are healthier for the environment. And I'll buy the fact that for the most part, they're healthier for the animals because it doesn't require killing them prematurely, although then you get into philosophical issues about old age. If it is true that a child can be healthy, be a healthy weight on a ketogenic diet and can't be on a mostly plant diet, what is your obligation as a parent? Do you put your child's welfare above or below the environmental implications of the diet, the ethical implications of eating animals? This is a hypothetical. I don't know if it's true. I can argue that in the U.S., the latest numbers are so crazy. Like 1 in 5 kids suffer from obesity. I hope I'm wrong about that, by the way. I was just looking at the graph yesterday, and I'm hoping I misread it. But let's say it's 1 in 10. Those kids, I believe, are at a social and physical. I think this disorder creates an awful. It's just, if kids didn't have to live with obesity, I'm trying to figure out, because you're just trying to walk around all the sort of social issues with even talking about it. But my belief is that if a child had a choice between being lean or living with obesity, they would choose lean if they knew they had a choice. That it would be an easier life. They wouldn't be judged. They could be physically more active. They could be more athletic. It would be easier. They wouldn't have to carry the weight around. They wouldn't have to deal with the social issues of carrying the weight around. If I'm wrong about that, I apologize. If that's true, and they can be a normal, average weight, relatively lean on a ketogenic diet, what is a parent's obligation? And I can't answer that question. It's clearly something a parent has to answer for themselves. But what I can do is argue, is it true or not? Here's the evidence. And then suggest, the parent can say, even with adults, I have a very good friend who has Parkinson's, and she doesn't, I said, look, there is evidence that ketogenic diets help Parkinson's, and they reasonably assume that they might slow down the progression of this otherwise progressive chronic disease that's going to rob you of, the physical freedom you would have otherwise had in your later years. And I can't get her to do a 3-month experiment. I'm saying, just try it for 3 months. If it works, you might, if you feel better and you've got more energy and you more movement and less tremor, then you can decide whether it's worth it. And if it doesn't work, hey, great. It's no longer an issue. I'll shut up. And but these are the kind of issues that come up. What happened getting back to my book, Rethinking Diabetes, in the diabetes world. So beginning in the 1950s, researchers led by Ancel Keys famously decide that first total cholesterol, then LDL cholesterol causes heart disease, and the LDL cholesterol is elevated by the saturated fat content of the diet, and so we should eat low-fat diets for our hearts. And people with diabetes are at very high risk, relatively high risk of dying of heart disease. And so the decision was made, in effect, to sacrifice blood sugar for cholesterol. Beginning in 1971, the American Diabetes Association starts telling patients with diabetes that they should eat low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets. That will keep their cholesterol down, and they argue that there's not profound evidence that it will raise their blood sugar, even though there's basically a century of clinical experience saying people who eat carbs, that's what raises blood sugar. So from 1971 onward, the ADA, the American Diabetes Association, gets progressively more dogmatic about this. They are telling patients with a disease of carbohydrate intolerance to get more than half of the calories in their diet from carbohydrates, such that they will keep their cholesterol low, and this will reduce their risk of heart disease, even though they know that having high blood sugar from a carbohydrate-rich diet will increase their risk of heart disease. But they believe that can be treated by drugs, insulin, and what are called oral hypoglycemic agents. They do clinical trials testing the ability of the drug therapy to reduce what they call macrovascular complications, heart disease, strokes, and it doesn't seem to work. In fact, in some of the clinical trials, the people who are on higher doses of insulin to have lower blood sugar have more complications and die more prematurely than people on low blood sugar. And every time these trials come out, they collectively scratch their heads and say, "Oh, that's a surprise." One of my favorite quotes from the New York Times was it's around 2012, a diabetes specialist at Harvard Medical School saying, we have to have an adult conversation about this, but they never do. They never bother to test this idea that patients, that the cause of the diabetic complications are the carb-rich diets and drug therapy that's used to treat the symptoms of eating the carb-rich diets, and that the patients wouldn't conceivably do much better, if not thrive, on low-carb diets.
And in other areas where guidelines have changed, it's been very, very quietly done, like cholesterol, changes to the view about eggs, changes on low fat. It hasn't been a very public, open, we now recognize this, it's very much when the science is bad and when the foundations, are shaken up and changed, it's very, very quietly seeped out to the public. Right. It's not a recognition.
Keep in mind that we knew that dietary cholesterol has no meaningful effect on serum cholesterol, the cholesterol in your blood, since the 1960s.
My goodness.
So that very quiet change in guidance was made 50 years after it was blindingly obvious that this is meaningless advice. The reason the advice was given at all was because the American Heart Association was giving it, thought it's going to be too complicated to tell people they can eat cholesterol. That's fine. They just want to avoid saturated fat because saturated fat raises the cholesterol level in the blood, whereas the cholesterol in foods doesn't have any meaningful effect. And that starts getting complicated, and so they needed a simple message, and the simple message was avoid all fat. And in the process, this assumption people made that somehow they should be avoiding cholesterol like in eggs.
Interesting. But back onto your book and your key points, you tell a story about somebody you were interviewing, or they interviewed you and then you interviewed them for the book, and that person was diagnosed with type 1, I believe. And his view is, I think, just really clarifies what you're talking about here in terms of the insulin and the treatment and the carbohydrates.
Yeah, it's true. And this story I'm about to tell you, originally I had this as an epigraph, one of those quotes in italics in the beginning of the book. And then I decided, well, if I have that in the beginning of the book, nobody's going to read the rest of the book.
That's funny.
For good or bad. So the fellow in question, Russ Wolin was is a chef who became a journalist and was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in his mid to late 30s. And when I wrote my book, The Case Against Sugar, Russ interviewed me for that, or maybe it was the case for Keto, for one of my books. And he told me his story. I asked him, same way I asked you off air, what your background is. And I said, well, I'm going to do a book on diabetes. So when I do that, I want to interview you about your experience. And we're both journalists. So Russ's experience is he's diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in his mid to late 30s. He, when you're diagnosed with a disease like that, it's, your life goes, you've got symptoms, right? But other than that, you've never thought about this in your life. And suddenly you're thrust into disease land where you have to learn everything you can as quick as you can. Everything's a mystery. It's hard to imagine a more traumatic scenario, although far too many people go through it. So he gets his diagnosis, and his physician is explaining to him what's going to happen now. And he says, well, your body isn't producing enough insulin, so we're going to give you insulin therapy. You're going to be injecting yourself with insulin, and you're going to be eating a set amount of carbohydrates every day to cover the insulin. And Russ says to his doctor, wait, let me just make sure I understand this. You're saying that I now have this disease and insulin is the antidote, but the antidote can be deadly, so I'm going to have to eat carbs and take the antidote rather than not take the antidote and not eat the carbs. Okay, so I should have put it this way. I'm now carbohydrate intolerant, he says. It's been a while since I've discussed this. I can't eat carbs. In order that I can, I have to take insulin. So the symptoms are caused by the carbohydrates. Insulin is the antidote. Your response is eat the carbs, take the drug, take the antidote. Why don't I just not eat the carbs? And I don't need the antidote. Mm-hmm. And the doctor looks at him and scratches his head and basically has never really thought about it like this. And he says, but, we want you to live as natural, normal a life as possible, which is what they want. So you should get to eat what everyone eats. And if what you eat makes you thick, we have a drug for that. And Russ's point was, if I don't eat it, I don't eat the drug. Problem solved. You do actually with type 1 need a little bit of insulin for anything. And then he says to his doctor, why don't I try a ketogenic diet? He does some research and the doctor says, well, people have trouble complying with the ketogenic diet. They find it hard to stick to. And he says, well, if I came to you and said, I hear that exercise is good for diabetes, I'm going to run an hour a day, you wouldn't advise me not to run because people have difficulty sticking with hour-a-day exercise programs. You would say, bravo, good for you.
Yeah. Sensible.
So why are you telling me the opposite with the diet? If I don't stick to it, we'll come back and solve something else. So you see how all these thought processes get wrapped up and they become so natural to these doctors that they never think critically. They never challenge their own assumptions until something goes wrong or until they have a patient like Russ who does a ketogenic diet and then seems to be doing, compared to their other patients, remarkably well. This is often the sort of conversion experience in our community.
Absolutely. That's what I've heard from a number of the very, very prominent doctors that now proponents of low carb, that a patient came and then a second patient came, ignored their advice and did fantastically. Luckily, those people were curious enough to ask some questions and have those dialogues with those patients and learn and be open-minded enough to say, I got it wrong and this is better for you. But in terms of... go on.
I'm interrupting you. My mother used to say, don't talk while I'm interrupting.
I like her.
I like her too. This is why I thought diabetes was, diabetes should be the tipping point in these discussions. People have trouble with the ketogenic diet for obesity. They say any diet where you eat less is going to solve that problem, and it just works by eating less. Diabetes, we know that this is a disease where the carbohydrates have a unique place in the diet. And most people don't want to be on drug therapy their whole life. And if they have to inject insulin, that's a whole new world entirely. And if you have retinopathies and suddenly your doctor ophthalmologist wants to do injections into your eyeballs, you start thinking maybe there's a better way to do this. I had one of the doctors I interviewed who had type 1 diabetes. He was a radiologist, so he had to be able to read scans, and his eyesight was going. And when the doctor talked about the eyeball injections, he said, "Oh, wait a minute. let me see. Let me do some research and see if there's a better approach." And he went on a ketogenic diet and minimized his insulin use, and his eyesight cleared up. His retinopathies apparently went away. So it's sort of, I document the clinical trials. So beginning in the early 2000s, with the awareness of the obesity epidemic, physicians like Eric Westman and others start doing clinical trials. on ketogenic diets for weight loss. Back then, called it Atkins. Now it's keto. And in some of these populations, there are a large number of patients with diabetes who are also obese. So rather than exclude them from the population, the physicians included them and saw that the diabetes gets much better. If not resolves, apparently goes into remission. If you don't eat carbohydrates, you don't have the symptoms that come from eating the carbohydrates. I got to the point where what I can say is I can imagine a scenario where physicians, and this is what I hope for, I don't think diet therapy will ever be the dominant advice it's given, because the physicians will always think that drug therapy is easier. Patients prefer drug therapy. But if you say to your patient, newly diagnosed, and talking type 2 here because it's simpler, there are basically two paths we could put you on. One is you pretty much get to eat whatever you want. We want you to maintain your weight. And if you're overweight or obese, you're going to have to restrict how much food you eat and eat less, but you could still eat the carbs and the juices and the cakes and the ice cream and drink your beer and have a nice life. And we have drugs to cover all the side effects. You'll be at higher risk of all these chronic diseases, including neuropathies, which can lead to lower limb amputations, and retinopathies, which can lead to you going blind, but you'll get to eat your cake and ice cream. Or you eat this keto thing, so now you're living on, meat and fish and fowl and green leafy vegetables and butter and cheese and and there are a lot of people who like it and think it's great, and some people, me, we're biased. And if you do this, your diabetes is likely to go into remission, and you won't have symptoms, and you won't have the drug therapy, and you won't apparently have to worry about the increased risk of heart disease and stroke and cancer and dementia and the neuropathies and the amputations and the retinopathies and the blindness. Your choice. And I think if presented in that way, most patients would at least say, well, let me try this diet thing, because I'm not sure the other path you described is something I want to go down.
It's giving people the option, isn't it? It's not going to be for everybody, but it's giving people that information that's their right to have.
Yeah, which requires the physician's understanding both sides. That's one of the key, and the diabetes educators and endocrinologists. And then when we get to who did I write my book for, it's like it should be required reading for them, so they understand enough so they can say, and then, ideally they look at the studies I quote in the papers, and they can draw their conclusions whether I'm being a fair and reliable reporter or not. But for the physician to do that, they have to understand our perspective. They can't pretend to understand it or, and that takes work. But at least in the U.S., patients suffering from obesity and diabetes and their complications and consequences make up a large portion of all the patients that physicians see in family practices and pediatric practices.
Yeah.
I mean,
and same around the world, UK, Australia, Canada. It's, and preventable, and some of this is very, very, very reversible as well. I've got a story of somebody I worked with when I was in the working with patients in the NHS. I was doing low carb nutrition groups, and on the second group of this particular practice, I had an engineer come to one of the groups. His name was Harish, and he explained what he'd been doing for his diabetes. So he had read all the books he could find. He'd listened to lectures. He had travelled up and down the country. He'd gone to India for a retreat, and he came back so sick with the food that they'd given him. A medical friend had told him he needed to eat pineapple every day with every meal. He'd done that, and that hadn't worked either. He really was trying everything. 12 years he was diabetic. And within the first 2 sessions, you could just see the light switch on and he just got it. I mean, it's just as simple as you've just said with your story with Russ. And he just, he changed everything, went home, brought his wife to the next session, went home, cleared out the pantry, got rid of the chapati flour, was just so keen and so switched on about how to switch the foods. And he was, within 3 months, he was off 2 of his medications and he was on half a dose of metformin. And then that was gone within a few months, lost weight as well, off statins. Yeah. And you just think, 12 years and he had been trying. So you made a comment, you've made it a couple of times, in that the medical profession, often I hear this, and I see this in writing as well, that parents of children and adults who have a diagnosis, they won't adhere to a diet. They can't change a diet and they won't sustain it. So, as a large community of people who I know have reversed conditions, come off medication, are highly motivated and are trying all sorts of solutions that are false, dead ends, not backed by science. I really feel it's about giving people those options. Back, and just on a comment on your story with your chef friend or colleague Ross, you mentioned in that, and in the retelling of that, I heard you or Ross say that carbs are a toxin. So do you believe that carbs are a toxin in this situation with type 2 diabetes?
That carbs are a toxin. I mean, essentially, yeah, your body cannot metabolize them safely. Slow toxin, as Rob Lustig would say, not, an acute toxin, not something that kills quickly, but over the course of years to decades, it increases your risk of dying from virtually every chronic disease. It's crazy. I think one of the mistakes people make here is that they talk about adhering to a diet as opposed to adhering to good health.
Yeah.
So, if we're right, you go on a ketogenic diet, you basically abstain from eating the carbohydrate-rich foods that you can no longer metabolize safely. Now you feel better. Now you don't have the symptoms of a disease. You're not trying, even if you put your obesity into remission in effect, or your predisposition to obesity or diabetes, you're not adhering to the diet. You're doing what's necessary to be healthy. You want to remain healthy, and that means you don't eat these foods, so you don't eat those foods. I get that people will suffer from cravings. We all did, in foods that, it's hard to be, for physiological as well as psychological reasons, it's hard to be around. Just like if you're an ex-smoker or a reformed alcoholic, you can't hang out with smokers and people who drink all the time, because you're always going to be tempted to fall off the wagon. So you have to deal with those issues one way or the other. When I wrote my book, The Case for Keto, when I interviewed 120 odd physicians who had come around to thinking like we do, and many of them talked about what they did as sort of carbohydrate addiction treatment programs. You have to get people to realize that these diseases, their symptoms are caused by the carbohydrate content of the diet, and while they crave it and will always crave these foods, they can learn to live without them and to be happy without them and to eat well without them. I think a lot of my perspective is informed by the fact that I was a smoker and I tried to quit for 20 years. A lot of journalists, smoking and drinking is what gets you through the day. Pretty much every morning I woke up, I tried to quit, or I tried to sustain quitting until eventually I succeeded with the help of Nicorette's nicotine gum. I still occasionally, twice a day, chew a Nicorette. 20 years after I quit, 24 years after I quit.
You have a Nicorette habit.
The point is, for the first 3 months that you're quitting, first 3 weeks you're miserable. The nicotine withdrawals, it's just constantly craving a cigarette. And then for roughly the first 3 months, you're just generally unhappy. And you're constantly in danger of falling off the wagon. Like if you're walking down the street and you see somebody smoking, you'll bum a cigarette from them before you can stop yourself. The first year, cranky, bitchy, unhappy. And then by year 2, you're no longer interested in smoking. And by year 3, you can't understand why you ever smoked. And I say, in some level, I could not imagine drinking a glass. I could imagine smoking a cigarette more easily than I could drinking a glass of orange juice at this point, which sounds crazy, but it's just, when I first tried Atkins as an experiment, I went through, there were severe cravings for 3 weeks, although it's a much easier thing to get over than quitting cigarettes or alcohol. I mean, it's a different kind of craving, but you get over it, and then you're perfectly happy eating the foods that you do like. And when you shift to keto, you shift your body to burning fat for fuel rather than carbs. So a lot of your cravings become about fat rather than fatty foods, rather than carb-rich foods. Although, put me at a dinner table with my wife and she orders dessert and I'm going to crave it. There's no getting around it. So
interesting still after all these years. So that makes me very curious about what you do eat day to day.
I don't eat breakfast anymore. I'm one of these. I tried that as an experiment, intermittent fasting, and I found I think better in the mornings when I don't eat. And I also lost 10 pounds I didn't think I needed to lose. So I stuck with that. And then for lunch, I have, meat, fish, or fowl with green vegetables and salad, and same for dinner. I'll cook for my family, and my wife is a mostly vegetarian, so she'll eat everything I make minus the meat. My kids are kids, and they'll eat everything if I force them to. And I'll eat what I make minus the starch. And my kids will have a little dessert. My wife might have dessert, and I'll have a piece of cheese.
Yeah. We talked before we jumped on about the range of different meals in our households and how we adapt the different meals, and yes, it makes cooking a bit more interesting, a bit more of a chore. But yours sounds very, very simple, what you're eating.
It is. I mean, mostly people make a big deal out of ketogenic diets. It's just not eating the starches and the sweets.
Yeah.
If you really have issues with obesity and diabetes, you have to start watching, the sauces in restaurants and the sugar and starch-rich gravies and the like. But for the most part, you're just not eating the starches and the sweets and the legumes. And it's interesting, 200 years ago, 1825, the most famous book ever written about food was published, called The Physiology of Taste, by a French lawyer turned gastronome who spent 25 years on this book. It was published posthumously. And he said, the only way to control your weight is more or less rigid abstinence to what he called them farinaceous elements of the diet, but that means starchy elements of the diet.
And that was all of that time ago. So, there has been a long history of using diet, and then we fell away from it completely. So, using drug interventions as our preference, and throwing drugs at a problem, at a chronic disease, and then adding more of that quantity, refining those drugs, and then adding more drugs. What are your thoughts on the new wave of drugs that are very, very popular, that are kind of hit like a wave?
Yeah, they're clearly wonder drugs. They do wondrous things for people who have struggled with their weight their whole lives. I worry about the long-term consequences of being on any drugs, and these are powerful drugs. And I've seen people's lives ruined taking prescriptions that their doctors wrote that seemed perfectly reasonable and ended up doing awful things to them and that they couldn't get off. So it's sort of We have data on these obesity drugs for 2 or 3 years only. We know that when people go off them, they gain the weight back. That's true, our argument, carbohydrates are fattening. If you go off them, you reverse the fattening process. If you go back on them, they're still fattening. You gain the weight back. But in this case, these are powerful drugs, and they're doing things that are non-physiological. So they're designed to have effects much greater than would naturally occur from these molecules when naturally secreted and in areas of the body that they wouldn't naturally affect. And it just worries me. But I know people who have solved lifelong obesity problems. I think could they have done the same thing with the ketogenic diets? Possibly. In fact, with some people for whom the drugs didn't work are also people for whom the ketogenic diet didn't work. So, and there's an argument that they work in very similar ways physiologically. The insulin experience was a bit frightening, learning about this wave of complications with insulin therapy and how it came crashing in, 10, 15 years after this wonder drug was started to be used widely, gave me a kind of scary context in which to think about these things. And I hope that I'm just, I hope I'm wrong. And I hope, but it's regrettably, we will find out one way or the other.
Yeah, one way or the other. And we jumped right in as your case in history with the insulin. We've repeated really, so time will tell. In terms of to close, in terms of how people can follow you, what's the best types of what do you prefer? I know you're pretty active, for example, on Twitter, and I've been following your Substack for a while. You've got quite a large following there, and talk about really interesting subjects: red meat, saturated fat, dietary guidelines, cheese, and sometimes cancer as well.
Yeah. So the Substack is that I'm doing with Nina Teicholz, Unsettled Science, it's called. We're in that's where I'll be doing most of my writing for the foreseeable future. I used to send people to my blog, but now the blog is just a place where I say, go read Unsettled Science. So Unsettled Science, it's a combination of, writing. I mean, Nina and I are arguably the two only really critical journalists in the nutrition space. We approach it from slightly different perspectives and interests. I'm interested in the science. She's a little bit more interested in the social and financial conflicts of the researchers. But I think it's one of the few places you can go to get the sort of reliable assessment of the state of the science and the kind of, I still think nutrition science is almost unbelievably pseudoscientific. I'm stunned by some of the stuff we read, and it's possible I'm just crazy.
No. Yeah, I'd go with that. Did you read the Times article that's just come out on ultra-processed food? It's pretty pro.
London Times or New York Times?
No, sorry, not the Times. Time magazine.
No, are they? I mean, ultra-processed food is an interesting story in and of itself. We could do a whole hour on
next
that.
One.
But I have issues with the concept and the way it's studied. And the use of anyway, that's a longer story. But yeah, the nutrition and the journalists who cover nutrition are not, most areas of journalism, journalists are taught to be skeptical of the people they're interviewing. Political reporters aren't taught to believe politicians are ever telling the truth and to just report what they faithfully say. They're taught to think critically about it. and get different perspectives. But in nutrition science, a lot of science reporting, the journalists think of themselves as translators of the science for the public, and they think of the people they're interviewing as unambiguous experts in the field. They don't say to themselves, well, obesity, I'm dealing with a field where in the past 60 years, obesity levels have more than tripled in the United States. Maybe the experts don't know what they're talking about. And maybe I should interview them skeptically rather than faithfully report what they tell me as though it's dogma, but they don't think like that. So you get the nutritionists and the researchers doing bad science and the reporters communicating what they say without skepticism. And it's terrible. I mean, again, assuming I'm right and not excessively biased, a very bad situation.
What message would you like to give to somebody who's perhaps just been diagnosed with diabetes, or has maybe, like my person I worked with, Harris, who's had diabetes for 12 years? Is there a message that you'd like, something that you would like them to know?
If a particular food group causes problems, seriously consider just avoiding that food group. It's that simple. If it's the carbs in the diet that are causing your symptoms, which your doctors would on some level accept, consider it's a reasonable approach to not eat those foods. It's that simple. Don't eat the foods and take the antidote. Just avoid the foods, skip the antidote, and skip all the consequences of long-term drug therapy, which nobody likes.
Beautiful. That says a lot. Thank you. Thank you for your time today, and thank you very much for this book, which is really very needed, but also all of the work and the influence you've had in changing public health. Thanks, Gary.
Well, thank you, Claire, for the kind words and for having me on.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please make sure to subscribe. This really helps us to be able to create more content.